The year was 2347, and humanity had finally done what their ancestors had only dreamed about. They had built ships that could travel faster than light. They had reached beyond their small blue planet and touched the stars. For centuries, they had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. Now they had their answer. The galaxy was full of life, and it was time for humanity to introduce itself. The United Earth Coalition had spent years preparing for this moment. They had chosen their best, and to represent the human race. At the head of this historic mission was Ambassador Daniel. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had spent 20 years as a soldier before he put down his weapons and picked up the tools of diplomacy. He believed that words could achieve what bullets could not. He believed that understanding could bridge any gap between species. His ship was called the Horizon. It was not a warship. It carried no heavy weapons. It was painted white and blue to show peaceful intentions. The crew was small. Only 50 people had been chosen for this journey. Among them was Lieutenant Cross. She was young and brilliant. Her job was to handle all communications between the ship and Earth. She had worked with Daniel for 3 years and she trusted him completely. She believed in his vision of a peaceful galaxy, where humans could live alongside alien species as friends and partners. The journey to Prime took 2 weeks. Prime was the capital world of the Galactic Council. The Council was a governing body made up of over 400 different alien species. They had ruled this part of the galaxy for more than 10,000 years. Their laws were absolute. Their power was unquestioned. Every species that wanted to exist in Council space had to bow to their authority. When the Horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Prime, the crew gathered at the windows to look at the alien world. It was a massive planet with rings of silver metal orbiting around it. Space stations the size of cities floated in its orbit. Ships of every shape and size moved through the darkness. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. A voice came through the communications system. It was cold and unwelcoming. The voice told them to follow a specific flight path to the surface. Any deviation would result in the destruction of their vessel. Looked at Daniel with worry in her eyes. He simply smiled and told her that first impressions were often rough. He told her to have faith. The Horizon landed on a platform made of black stone. Alien guards surrounded the ship immediately. They were tall creatures with 4 arms and faces that showed no emotion. Daniel straightened his uniform and walked down the ramp with his head held high. Followed close behind him, along with a small team of advisors and security personnel. They were escorted through massive corridors made of strange metals and glowing crystals. The architecture was impressive but cold. There was no warmth in this place, no art on the walls, no music in the air. Everything was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. The council chamber was enormous. Seats rose up in circles around a central platform. Hundreds of alien species sat in those seats. Some had scales. Some had feathers. Some looked like nothing Daniel had ever seen or imagined. They all stared down at the human delegation with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. At the highest seat sat High Counselor. His species had held the most power in the council for thousands of years. They were reptilian creatures with green scales and yellow eyes. Was old even by standards. His scales had faded to a dull gray, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who had crushed countless enemies. Daniel stepped onto the central platform and bowed respectfully. He introduced himself and his species. He spoke of Earth and its history. He told them about humanity's long journey from caves to cities to the stars. He spoke of wars and suffering, but also of art and music and love. He painted a picture of a species that had struggled and failed and risen again. A species that had finally learned to work together. A species that wanted nothing more than to join the galactic community in peace. The chamber was silent when he finished, then spoke. His voice was like gravel scraping against stone. He asked Daniel why the council should care about such a young and insignificant species. He pointed out that humanity had only just discovered faster-than-light travel while they had mastered it before humans had learned to make fire. He called humans primitive. He called them dangerous. He called them a mistake of evolution that the galaxy would be better without. Daniel did not rise to the insult. He remained calm and respectful. He explained that humanity's youth was precisely why they could offer fresh perspectives. He talked about trade possibilities. He mentioned the resources of the Sol system. He offered cultural exchange programs and scientific cooperation. He offered friendship. Laughed. It was an ugly sound that echoed through the chamber. Other council members joined in. The laughter went on for a long time. When it finally stopped, announced that the council would consider humanity's request. They would deliberate and deliver their verdict. 3 days passed. Daniel and his crew were kept in a small section of guest quarters. They were not allowed to explore. They were not allowed to speak with other species. Guards watched their every move. Spent her time monitoring communications back to Earth. She reported everything to the coalition leadership. President Cole himself sent a message of encouragement. He told Daniel that Earth was proud of him. On the 4th day, they were summoned back to the chamber. Announced the council's decision. Humanity would be granted provisional membership in the galactic community, but there were conditions. Earth must surrender its entire military fleet. Earth must submit to oversight on all matters of technology and expansion. Earth must accept its place at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. The chamber fell silent again. Everyone waited to see how the human would respond. Daniel took a deep breath. He thought about his children back on Earth. He thought about all the humans who had fought and died throughout history to ensure that their descendants would never have to kneel before tyrants. He thought about what it meant to be human. Then he spoke. His voice was calm but firm. He thanked the council for their consideration. He expressed gratitude for the opportunity to speak, but he could not accept these terms. Humanity would not surrender its ability to defend itself. Humanity would not bow to any species. They had come seeking equals and they would accept nothing less. His yellow eyes narrowed. No one had ever refused the council before. This small human from a primitive world had just made the biggest mistake of his short life. Daniel did not know it yet, but his refusal had just started a chain of events that would shake the galaxy to its core. High Counselor sat alone in his private chambers after the human delegation had been escorted away. His yellow eyes stared at nothing as his mind worked through what had just happened. In all his centuries of life, he had never witnessed such defiance. Species far older and more powerful than humanity had crumbled before the Council's demands. They had surrendered their fleets. They had bowed their heads. They had accepted their place in the natural order of the galaxy. But this human had refused. This Daniel had stood in the heart of power and said no. The word echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. No, such a small word, such enormous consequences. Was not simply offended, he was afraid. He had read the reports about humanity. He knew about their history. He knew about their wars. These creatures had spent most of their existence trying to kill each other. They had developed weapons of terrible power. They had split the atom and burned entire cities to ash. They had poisoned their own world and still survived. They were violent and unpredictable, and they never seemed to know when they were beaten. A species like that could not be allowed to roam free among the stars. They had to be contained. They had to be controlled, or they had to be destroyed. Called a secret meeting with his closest allies on the council. They were species that owed their positions to support. They would do whatever he asked. He explained his plan to them. They would invite the human ambassador to a private negotiation session. They would make him believe that a better deal was possible. And when he arrived alone and unprotected, they would make an example of him. They would show the galaxy what happened to those who the council. The other counselors agreed immediately. Some of them smiled at the thought of human blood on the chamber floor. The next morning sent a message to Daniel. The message was polite and respectful. It spoke of misunderstandings and the possibility of finding common ground. It invited the ambassador to a private meeting with the inner council to discuss alternative arrangements, promised that a solution could be found that would satisfy everyone. Lieutenant Cross read the message before showing it to Daniel. She did not trust it. Something about the words felt wrong. The shift from open hostility to friendly invitation was too sudden. She told Daniel that it could be a trap. She begged him to refuse or at least to bring a full security team. Daniel listened to her concerns. He understood them, but he also believed in the power of dialogue. He had spent his entire career proving that enemies could become friends if given the chance. He had negotiated with terrorists and warlords and dictators. He had walked into dangerous situations before and walked out with peace agreements in hand. He believed he could do it again. He told that he had to try. If there was even a small chance of achieving peaceful relations with the council, he had to take it. He told her that this was why he had come to the stars. Not to fight, not to conquer, but to build bridges between worlds. Wanted to argue, but she knew that look in his eyes. She had seen it many times before. Once Daniel made up his mind, nothing could change it. So she did the only thing she could do. She activated a hidden recording device in his uniform. She linked it to a secure channel that would transmit everything back to the horizon in real time. If something went wrong, at least Earth would know what happened. Daniel walked alone through the corridors of the council building. Guards escorted him, but they kept their distance. The halls were empty and silent. His footsteps echoed off the cold metal walls. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he pushed the feeling aside. Fear was natural. Courage was acting despite the fear. The private chamber was smaller than the main council hall, a circular room with no windows and only one door. 10 council members sat in a semicircle facing a single chair in the center, sat at the middle of the group. His yellow eyes tracked Daniel as he entered the room. Daniel bowed respectfully and took his seat. He began to speak about possible compromises. Perhaps humanity could agree to certain restrictions on military expansion in exchange for full diplomatic recognition. Perhaps a period of observation could satisfy the Council's concerns about human aggression. He was reasonable. He was calm. He was hopeful. Let him talk for several minutes. Then he raised one clawed hand, and the guards who had escorted Daniel grabbed him from behind. They forced him to his knees. They held his arms so tightly that he could feel bones grinding together. Daniel did not panic. He looked up at and asked what this meant. His voice was steady even though his heart was pounding. Stood and walked toward him slowly. He pulled a ceremonial blade from his robes. It was an ancient weapon passed down through generations of rulers. It had tasted the blood of 100 species. Now it would taste human blood for the first time. Announced that Daniel was guilty of crimes against the Galactic Order. He listed false charges: possession of weapons of mass destruction, conspiracy against the Council, intent to destabilize galactic peace. None of it was true, but truth had never mattered to those who held power through fear. Daniel tried to speak. He tried to defend himself and his species, but was not interested in words. He was interested in sending a message. The blade came down. Back on the horizon, Cross watched the transmission in horror. She saw Daniel fall. She saw the blood spread across the chamber floor. She heard announced to the galaxy that this was the fate of all who the Council. The broadcast was being transmitted to every world in Council space. Billions of beings were watching a human die. Daniel's last words came through the hidden communicator. His voice was weak but clear. He said, "Tell them I tried." Then there was only silence. Stood frozen for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then she started screaming orders. She told the pilot to prepare for emergency departure. She told the crew to arm themselves. She sent a distress signal to Earth with the full recording of what had just happened. They tried to stop them. Ships moved to block their escape. Weapons locked onto the horizon. But the human pilot was skilled and desperate. He pushed the engines beyond their limits. He dodged fire that should have destroyed them. He found a gap in the blockade and he took it. The horizon jumped to faster than light speed with burn marks on its hull and wounded crew members bleeding on the deck, held pressure on a wound in her shoulder, and watched the stars blur around them. She had escaped, but Daniel was gone, and she carried with her the recording that would change everything. When the transmission reached Earth, the entire planet went quiet. People stopped in the streets. Factories fell silent. For one long moment, all of humanity shared the same emotion. Then the quiet ended, and what replaced it was something that the galaxy had never seen before. It was the fury of an entire species awakened. The recording played on every screen on Earth. In homes and offices and schools and hospitals, people watched in silence as Ambassador Daniel was murdered. They saw him kneel on the cold floor of an alien chamber. They saw the blade rise and fall. They heard his final words, "Tell them I tried." Nobody spoke, nobody moved, the world had stopped. President Cole stood in his office in the capital city of the United Earth Coalition. He was a man who had seen much in his 60 years of life. He had led armies. He had buried friends. He had made decisions that haunted his sleep, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him to watch one of his people be slaughtered like an animal while the galaxy laughed. His hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. Behind him stood General Drake and Admiral Lisa Monroe. They were the highest-ranking military officers on Earth. They had served with distinction in the border wars that had united humanity decades ago. They had helped build the peace that had allowed humans to reach the stars. Now they watched their leader with concern. They had never seen Cole shake before. The president turned to face them. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady when he spoke. He asked them a simple question. He asked them if the military was ready. General Drake straightened his spine. He was a large man with a face and hands that had seen combat. He told the president that the First Fleet was fully operational. 300 warships equipped with weapons that humanity had hoped would never be used. They had been built as a deterrent. They had been built just in case the galaxy was not as welcoming as humanity had hoped. Now that caution would prove wise. Admiral Monroe stepped forward. She was a smaller woman with sharp eyes and silver hair. She had commanded ships since before most of her crew was born. She told the president that she had known Daniel personally. She had served with him in the border wars. She had called him a friend. Her voice was calm, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. President Cole nodded slowly. He told them to prepare the fleet for immediate departure. Then he walked out of his office and headed for the Coalition Assembly Hall. The assembly was chaos when he arrived. Representatives from every nation on Earth were shouting at each other. Some demanded immediate war. Others counseled caution. Some were weeping openly. The murder of Daniel had broken something in the human spirit: trust, hope, the belief that the universe could be a place of peace and cooperation. President Cole took his place at the central podium. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there and let the silence spread. One by one, the representatives stopped talking. They turned to face their leader. They waited. Behind the president, a massive screen showed the recording on loop. Daniel kneeling, the blade falling, blood on the floor, "Tell them I tried," over and over again. When Cole finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. He did not shout. He did not need to. His words cut through the air like the blade that had killed their ambassador. He spoke of how humanity had reached out to the stars with open hands. He spoke of how those hands had been cut off and thrown back in their faces. He spoke of how Daniel had believed in peace so deeply that he had walked into a trap knowing the risks. He spoke of how that belief had been rewarded with murder. The chamber was completely silent. Some representatives were crying. Others sat with jaws clenched and eyes burning. President Cole asked the assembly what humanity's response should be. He told them that this was not his decision to make alone. The fate of their species hung in the balance. Every voice deserved to be heard. The vote was unanimous. Not a single representative abstained. Not a single voice called for restraint. The galaxy had drawn first blood. Now humanity would respond. President Cole turned to face a quantum communicator that linked Earth to every corner of known space. This technology allowed instant communication across light years. Every species in the galaxy would hear what he said next. Though the Council, all 400 species that had watched Daniel die and done nothing. The president spoke one word. Annihilation. The transmission ended. The screen went dark, and somewhere across the galaxy High Counselor felt the first cold touch of fear. In the hours that followed, Earth transformed. Shipyards that had been dormant roared to life. Workers flooded into factories that ran day and night. Weapons that had been locked away in underground bunkers were brought out and loaded onto ships. The entire industrial capacity of a unified planet turned toward a single purpose. General Drake took command of the ground forces. Millions of soldiers volunteered within the first day. Training camps filled to overflowing. Veterans who had retired years ago came back to serve. The human military grew faster than anyone had thought possible. Admiral Lisa Monroe took command of the First Fleet. Her flagship was called the Retribution. It was the largest warship humanity had ever built. Its hull was black, and its weapons systems were capable of cracking a planet in half. Lisa stood on the bridge and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Prime. Somewhere out there was the creature who had killed her friend. Lieutenant Cross arrived back on Earth a week after her escape. Her wounds had healed, but the look in her eyes had not. She delivered her report to President Cole personally. She told him everything she had seen and heard. She described the arrogance of the Council. She described the cruelty in its eyes. She described the way Daniel had faced death with dignity. The president listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her what she wanted to do next. She told him she wanted to go back. She wanted to be there when humanity delivered its response. She wanted to look in the eye before the end. President Cole promoted her to commander on the spot. He assigned her to Admiral Monroe's fleet. He told her that she would have her wish. 3 weeks after Daniel's death, the First Fleet was ready. 300 warships gathered in orbit around Earth. Their hulls gleamed in the light of the sun. Their weapons hummed with energy. Their crews stood ready at their stations. Admiral Monroe addressed the fleet through a secure channel. She told them that they were not going to war for revenge. They were going to war for justice. They were going to show the galaxy that humanity would not be bullied. They would not be murdered without consequence. They would not bow. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed. Earth grew small behind them and then disappeared entirely. Ahead lay space. Ahead lay the Council. Ahead lay the reckoning that the galaxy had brought upon itself. Humanity had come to the stars hopping for friends. Now they would show the galaxy what happened when you made them enemies instead. They had prepared for war. High Counselor had not survived for centuries by underestimating his enemies. The moment the human transmission ended, he had ordered the largest military buildup in history. 300 warships formed a defensive line at the edge of space. Another 200 were held in reserve near the ground forces numbered in the tens of millions. Anti-orbital weapons were activated on every major colony. Was confident. They had conquered dozens of species throughout their history. Their technology was advanced. Their warriors were trained from birth. They had never lost a war, and they did not intend to start now. The humans were newcomers to the stars. They were primitive and weak. Their anger would fade when they saw the might of the Empire arrayed against them. He was wrong. The First Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of space exactly 72 hours after leaving Earth. Admiral Lisa Monroe stood on the bridge of the Retribution and studied the enemy formation on her tactical display. 300 ships arranged in a classic defensive pattern. It was textbook military strategy. It was predictable. Lisa had spent her entire career studying war. She had read every military text ever written. She had analyzed battles from ancient Earth history to modern conflicts. She understood something that the did not. Humanity had spent most of its existence fighting itself. They had developed weapons and tactics through thousands of years of bloody conflict. They had learned lessons that the could not imagine. The admiral gave the order to attack. Human ships surged forward in formations that seemed chaotic but were precisely calculated. They did not fly in neat lines like the expected. They moved in waves and clusters that made targeting difficult. Their electronic warfare systems filled space with false signals and jamming frequencies. The sensors went blind. The first human weapons hit the line like a hammer, fired metal projectiles at speeds that turned them into devastating kinetic weapons. They punched through shields like they were made of paper. They tore through hulls and exploded reactors. Ships that had stood for centuries died in seconds. Directed energy weapons carved through the formation. Beams of concentrated light sliced warships in half. Human missiles carried payloads that disrupted power systems and left enemy vessels drifting helplessly in space. Fighter craft swarmed around larger ships and picked off escape pods with cold efficiency. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 300 warships were debris floating in the void. The human fleet had lost 12 vessels, 12 ships against 300. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Admiral Monroe did not pause to celebrate. She gave the order to advance toward the. News of the defeat reached within hours. He refused to believe it at first. He demanded confirmation. He screamed at his advisors and accused them of incompetence. But the reports kept coming. The human fleet was cutting through space like a blade through flesh. Colony after colony fell. Defense stations were destroyed. The reserve fleet engaged the humans and was annihilated just as quickly as the first. They came under siege within a week of the war beginning. Human ships surrounded the planet in an unbreakable blockade. Ground forces under General Drake prepared for landing operations. Troop transports waited for the order to descend. General Drake was a soldier who understood restraint. He had fought in wars where civilians died by the thousands. He had seen what happened when armies lost control. He had sworn that he would never let that happen under his command. His orders to the troops were clear. Military targets only, government facilities, weapons installations, command centers. Any soldier who harmed a civilian would face court-martial. This was not genocide, this was justice. The landing began at dawn on the. Human soldiers in powered armor dropped from the sky like metal rain. They hit the ground fighting and did not stop. Defenders were brave, but they were outmatched. Human weapons were more powerful. Human tactics were more advanced. Human soldiers fought with a fury that they had never seen before. City after city fell to the human advance. Government buildings were captured. Military bases were destroyed. Commanders surrendered by the dozens. Those who refused to surrender were killed without mercy. High Counselor fled before it fell. He took a private ship and ran to Prime. He believed that the Council would protect him. He believed that the other species would rally to defend their leader against the human threat. He was wrong about that too. The other Council species wanted nothing to do with the war. They had watched the execution of Daniel. Some had laughed. Some had applauded. Now they watched in horror as the consequences of that cruelty unfolded. The mighty empire was being dismantled by a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel a few decades ago. If the humans could do this to they could do it to anyone. One by one, the Council species sent messages to Earth. They claimed they had nothing to do with the execution. They claimed they had opposed from the beginning. They begged for mercy and promised friendship. President Cole read their messages and felt only disgust. They had watched a man die and done nothing. Now they wanted to pretend they were innocent. Commander Cross led the Second Fleet to Prime. She had requested this assignment personally. She wanted to be the one who finished what Daniel had started. She wanted to stand in the chamber where he had died and deliver humanity's final message. The Council capital offered no resistance. Their defense fleet stood down the moment human ships appeared. Their ground forces laid down weapons before a single shot was fired. They knew they could not win. They knew that fighting would only make things worse. Landed on Prime with a full Marine escort, she walked through the same corridors that Daniel had walked. She stood in the same chamber where he had bled out on the cold floor. The bloodstain was still there. No one had bothered to clean it. She activated her communicator and spoke to the Council. Her voice was broadcast to every world in Council space. She delivered humanity's demands. Surrender High Counselor to human custody. Dissolve the current Council government. Accept human oversight of a new galactic order, or watch Prime burn. The Council had 1 hour to decide. They took less than 10 minutes, was dragged from his hiding place by his own allies. They threw him at the feet of human soldiers and begged for their lives. The great High Counselor who had ruled the galaxy for centuries was now a prisoner. His yellow eyes were wide with terror. His scales had gone pale. He had finally understood what he had awakened. Humanity had come for justice, and humanity would not be. High Counselor was brought before a human military tribunal on the steps of the very chamber where he had murdered Ambassador Daniel. The irony was not lost on anyone. The galaxy's most powerful leader now knelt in chains on the same spot where a human had knelt before him just weeks earlier. The blood stain on the floor had been preserved as evidence. Representatives from every species in the former council were ordered to attend. They filled the seats that ringed the chamber. They watched in silence as the creature who had ruled them for centuries was treated like a common criminal. Some felt satisfaction, had bullied and threatened them for generations. Others felt fear. If the humans could bring down, they could bring down anyone. Commander Cross stood at the center of the chamber and read the charges against the accused. Murder of a diplomatic envoy, violation of galactic law, conspiracy to commit genocide against the human species. Each charge carried a sentence of death. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording of Daniel's execution had been seen by billions. President Cole had traveled to Prime personally for this moment. He sat in a chair that had been placed where the council's highest seat once stood. General Drake stood at his right hand. Admiral Lisa Monroe stood at his left. They represented the 3 pillars of human power: political, military, naval. Together they would pass judgment on the creature who had started this war. Was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense. It was more than he had given Daniel. The old rose to his feet and faced the tribunal with what remained of his dignity. His yellow eyes swept across the chamber. He saw enemies everywhere. Species that had bowed to him now looked at him with contempt. He spoke for nearly an hour. He claimed that he had acted in the best interest of the galaxy. He said that humans were dangerous. He said that their violent history proved they could not be trusted. He said that executing the ambassador had been necessary to protect galactic stability. He said that any leader would have done the same in his position. When he finished, President Cole looked at him for a long moment. The chamber was completely silent. Then the president spoke. He told that he was right about one thing. Humans were dangerous. They were the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever seen. They had spent thousands of years learning how to kill each other. They had developed weapons that could crack planets and poison stars. They had survived wars that should have destroyed them 100 times over. But they had also learned something else. They had learned that strength without mercy was tyranny. They had learned that power without compassion was cruelty. They had learned that the true measure of a civilization was not how it treated its friends, but how it treated its enemies. Daniel had come to the council seeking peace. He had offered friendship and cooperation. He had extended his hand in trust, and had cut that hand off and thrown it back in humanity's face. The president's voice grew cold. He told that humanity could have been the council's greatest ally. They could have shared technology and culture. They could have explored the galaxy together. They could have built something magnificent. Instead had chosen blood, and now he would pay the price. The verdict was guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad. The execution would take place immediately. Was dragged from the chamber to a courtyard outside, the same courtyard where he had once reviewed parades of soldiers. Now human soldiers lined the walls. Their weapons were raised and ready. Their faces showed no emotion. Commander Cross was given the honor of giving the final order. She had requested it. She had earned it. She stood before and looked into his yellow eyes. She wanted him to see her face. She wanted him to remember the species he had wronged. She spoke one word, fire. The shots echoed across Prime, fell and did not rise. His body lay on the cold stone where he had once stood in triumph. The most powerful being in the galaxy was now nothing more than a corpse. The execution was broadcast across the same channels that had carried Daniel's murder. Billions watched. Some cheered. Some wept. Some simply sat in stunned silence. The galaxy had changed forever in a matter of weeks. In the months that followed, humanity rebuilt the galactic order from the ground up. The old council was dissolved. A new assembly was formed with representatives from every species. Humanity took a leadership role, but they did not rule as tyrants. They remembered Daniel's dream. They honored it even as they enforced their will. The empire was dismantled piece by piece. Their military was disbanded. Their colonies were given independence. There was placed under international administration. The species that had terrorized the galaxy for 10,000 years was reduced to just another voice in the assembly. President Cole addressed the new Galactic Assembly on the one-year anniversary of Daniel's death. He spoke to representatives of 400 species who had once mocked humanity as primitive newcomers. He told them that humanity had not wanted this war. They had come to the stars seeking friendship and found only cruelty. They had extended their hand and received a blade through the heart. They had been forced to become the monsters that had always claimed they were. But the war was over now. The guilty had been punished. Justice had been served, and humanity was ready to try again. President Cole made a promise to the galaxy. Humanity would always extend its hand first. They would always seek peace before war. They would always give their enemies a chance to become friends. But he also made a warning. Strike that hand and we will close it into a fist. Humanity had shown what they were capable of when provoked. They had brought the mightiest empire in the galaxy to its knees in a matter of weeks. Any species that thought about repeating's mistake should remember what happened to him. The assembly gave President Cole a standing ovation, not because they loved humanity, but because they understood the truth. The galaxy had a new guardian, a species that was capable of terrible violence but chose to pursue peace, a species that would protect the weak and punish the cruel, a species that would never forget the man who had died believing in a better universe. A statue of Ambassador Daniel was erected in the center of the new assembly hall. It showed him standing tall with his hand extended in greeting. His face was calm and kind. His eyes looked toward a future he had not lived to see. The inscription at the base of the statue read simply, "He believed in peace. We honored his memory with victory." Humanity had taken its place among the stars. They had paid for it in blood and fire. But Daniel's dream lived on, and the galaxy would never be the same.